Welcome, everybody. We have an excellent presentation for you today on lessons learned from taking justice remote during COVID-19 pandemic. With me, we have the New Jersey Court's CIO, Jack McCarthy, and myself. We're going to go through how the court took justice remotely from a largely physical court to a remote virtual court. So the topics we have going on today are trends during the pandemic, background on the New Jersey court system, technologies used by New Jersey courts, how to run a remote court with 3 days of notice. And now we're in April, so it's a year later. Remote network services, summary, and contact information. So with that, we're going to go straight to trends. Okay, so one of the things we had seen back in April was we're connected to Homeland Security, the New Jersey version of Homeland Security, what we call MSISAC. So they were sending us a lot of information about threat actors in terms of Zoom bombing, Zoom emails that were fake in nature, as you can see by some of these emails that were going on. And we had seen just an upward tick in COVID-19 related domains, coronavirus. So we got a lot of communication concerning some key issues that were going on at that time. Clearly, the hackers were using COVID-19 to remain active and to get even more active in terms of hacking at that moment. I saw one report, a threat intelligence report, which actually was showing how if you were in Alabama, you were getting Alabama-specific coronavirus versus New York or versus South Carolina. So there were differences there. And obviously the pandemic continued. And in the last several months, obviously we all have seen this. We heard the shocking news of SolarWinds being, compromised, right? And the supply chain of SolarWinds being compromised. On the right side there, you can see the customers that SolarWinds has. Clearly, the federal government, major corporations like EMC, Ericsson, so on and so forth, universities, you name it, SolarWinds had it. So that has been a shock to the system entirely. And so we had continued through that. With some additional information on the background of New Jersey courts, Jack McCarthy is going to go right into that.
Thanks, Saj. A little brief history about me. I've been the CIO for the New Jersey courts for the last almost 9 years, although I think anybody that's lived in IT for the last year gets about an extra 5 years of experience from it. I had Saj's job back in about 13 years ago, when life was a lot easier and we didn't have things like SolarWinds and zero trust flying around at us. The judiciary itself, New Jersey is a little bit unique in that we're a statewide judiciary. What that means is back in 1995, we had a constitutional change that put all of the courts under one entity, and in our case, our central office, the administrative office of the courts. And so we're a little bit lucky in that I have everything from parking tickets up to Supreme Court opinions and cases, and they all fall into one data center, one giant network spread across the entire state. New Jersey serves 7 million residents. We have around 13,000 staff between the municipal courts and at the state level. We support roughly 100,000 attorneys in New Jersey, another 40,000 police officers. Our network is spread where every municipality has their own municipal court, as well as the county level courts and the state level. We have around 700 sites spread throughout the state. Back in February of 2020, we were largely 100% in person. So we did have some staff who would work at home occasionally, but generally we were an in-person shop. Very few mobile devices, as you see up on the slide. We had around 2,500 iPads and laptops, for our 13,000 staff, but we were generally, sitting at the desk, big giant boxes under the desk with dual monitors, et cetera. What we had to do was focus on moving all of that off-site and very rapidly. I came up with a quote back then. We did 6 months of work in about 6 days. But really wasn't that. It was the 6 years of planning that created all of that. And that's what we're going to walk through in the next few slides and talk about the planning that took place to get us to where we do, but also how we did it and how we did it securely. Just a little bit more about our technology, primarily a mainframe shop with our data center. Our network has grown over the years. From the 1970s and 80s, we were generally designed as a spoken wheel where everything out in the field headed to one egress point at the data center in Trenton. And as we, created LANs and WANs and moved on to our PCs and server technology, that continued, that design continued. Obviously, we have multiple backup plans. So every one of our sites heads back to Trenton on either 2 or 3 different platforms. So while it's a hub and wheel, it's also a lot of triangles in between where there is no single point of failure getting back to us. We do have a disaster recovery site where 4 times a year we fail our entire system up to our DR site. It allows us to go through every bit of technology we have and bring our system back up as if our data center in Trenton was gone. Obviously, having the cloud now has created additional issues with DR as well as benefits with DR. For our web applications, we have around 150 web applications. We are largely, as you'll see in most government places, we don't get rid of anything. So we have everything from COBOL, .NET, Java. A few years ago, we made a huge investment into business process modeling software. We run on our Pega platform. That allowed us to do a lot of what we were able to accomplish last March to get up and running, and I'll talk about that in a few slides. As I mentioned, limited mobile computing. We were, mostly people sitting at their desks. Mobility was really, at home on email. Otherwise, I was, generally sitting at my desk. If you walked into a courthouse in 2000 or in 2020, you were largely, doing the same kind of work, sitting at a PC, interacting with documents and data, but not a lot has changed since then. Our VPN was set up. We had the capacity, we thought, to do around 2,500 staff. We probably really were closer to 500 or 600 at a time. Generally, we never saw more than 100 people trying to connect through a VPN, and those were largely IT people working on the weekends, coming in and doing maintenance and other things. One of the big things that we had instituted was 2-factor authentication, and we had set up several policies over the last few years that anyone accessing any judiciary application, judiciary resource, would be doing so during 2-factor, and that was one of our huge benefits we got throughout the our work that we were doing last spring. Was we followed our secure platforms. If we had put policies in place and had to cut corners, we did it, but we didn't do it in a way that would affect security, and that really allowed us to continue to actually place more security onto our staff and network as we broke down the historic court walls and started moving people wherever they could work. You want to go to the next one, Saj?
Yep.
So how to run a court in 3 days notice. Back in March, I was sitting on the Rutgers golf course. I got a call from our Chief Justice on a Sunday who said, we are closing down the courts tomorrow. It was Sunday. I was on the 8th hole, and I sat on a conference call with him for the next 2 hours as we finished our round, and then an additional 2 hours. And we walked through what we were going to accomplish. What we thought we were going to do and what we ended up doing were night and day difference, because even on that phone call, we were still planning on using our internal network. We were still planning on having the judges sitting in the courtroom, running our system, using the capacity of our network and the recordation software that was going on in the courtrooms. Unfortunately, that all changed. As everybody knows, New York, New Jersey area was hit probably the hardest in the country in the early days. And after that call on Sunday, by about Wednesday, the Chief Justice said, no, we're going to be operating completely remotely. And all that's going to fall on the backs of our IT staff. And so what we did was we stepped back and I talked to my staff and I said, we have to come up with plans to be able to do three things. The first is make IT more efficient. So look where anywhere that we were running systems that were redundant, anything that we had to spend our time focusing on keeping, two staff doing the same thing. Let's get rid of all those systems and cut costs. Let's do what we could to rewrite systems, migrate them over to more modern platforms, and allow our staff to continue working. One of the benefits was we had migrated to the cloud. By migrating to the cloud, it allowed us to keep our developers up and running. They didn't have to come back to the data center through a VPN. They could connect directly to either AWS or whatever platform we were using to do their work. We had a second challenge, which was keep the windows open at the courthouses. As we have a fairly extensive electronic court system, and it allowed us to file most documents electronically, accept most payments electronically. But as we were closing the courthouse, we had to be able to do all documents electronically and all payments electronically. One of my staff on a Friday night came up with the idea of the judiciary electronic document submission, which was largely go to a website, file something and pay for it. And then we would handle the back end work, even if it was manually, at least it was electronic and we could transition it and transfer it to staff whenever it was had come in and move it wherever those staff might be. They actually had that system up and running and in production 3 days later. It was crude, but it was based on a lot of the policies and platforms that we had already put into our electronic court system. And what it was basically meant to do was fill gaps. Fast forward to now, it no longer fills gaps. It's actually going to probably become our proprietary, our primary software, and on how we're going to do this, because it was built in such a modern way. It doesn't have a lot of the complexity and a lot of the baggage that some of our own systems had. Another thing we had to do is we had to move everybody home almost overnight. As I mentioned, we only had 2,500 laptops. So how were we going to accomplish that? One of our tax court moms, when they closed the schools in New Jersey, a single mom in our tax court asked, can I take my PC home and connect it to my home network and then use it to connect back to us in some way? I went and, when I heard that, went and spoke to my boss and said, if we allow this to happen, we've fixed our problem with mobile devices. We treated our PCs just like giant laptops and sent them home. The reason we were able to do that is Saj and I had come up with a plan a few years before to encrypt every device in the judiciary, whether it was a laptop or desktop. So we knew that PC walking out of the building was already encrypted and we could protect the data from the judiciary. We knew when it connected back to us, we'd be protecting the transmission from the person's house back to us. And we knew we were in a good secure place to allow that to happen. I happen to live in another county beside where our home office is, and I was driving some laptops that night to drop off to that county. And as I pulled up outside the building, I saw hundreds of people walking out with PCs and sticking them in their cars to take them home. And that was the first idea that I think I had, and that I was able to share back with the Chief Justice and Administrative Director, that this was going to work, that our people were going to take their devices home and do whatever they could to keep the judiciary running. Another thing we had to do was for those staff that had PCs at home, maybe they had their own PC. We did run into a lot of problems with people that had kids at home or spouses at home trying to use their home PC to do their work or schoolwork. But we looked to expand initially our Citrix virtual desktop infrastructure, and then ended up scrapping that and switched to a VMware VDI, where we took from about 100 concurrent sessions and brought that up to 1,500 concurrent sessions. We generally saw around 1,450 concurrent sessions throughout the day. The one thing we did see was our staff hours. Because of schoolwork and things like that, staff a lot of times couldn't do the work during their normal 8:30 to 4:30 day. But instead, what we see is people logging in as early as 6 a.m. and staying on as late as 10, 11 o'clock at night. We routinely saw 95+% of people connecting either through the VPN or coming in through the VDI, whether it was our laptop, their desktop, etc. Now, as we took those desktops home and took our laptops home, we needed to increase our capacity for VPN. As I mentioned, we thought we had around 2,500 connections. It was probably closer to 700 or 800 connections at the time. But we were able to almost overnight take every server we had off the shelf and just start throwing capacity. We got it up to about 7,500 between the 1,500 VDIs and the 7,500 VPNs. We were able to stay running. Our WAN people a lot of times talked about walking by those servers and that there might be flames shooting out of the back. They were so overworked. But that gave us the brief bit of time, which took about a week, to then migrate some of our VPN up into AWS. Again, we had the connection to AWS through our Pega infrastructure, and we were able to very quickly create a secure VPN infrastructure up in AWS in about a little over a week, and then migrate a good portion of our capacity off of our infrastructure at our data center and move it up there. And then obviously that's going to be the future as we have a need in the future, hopefully never again, but if we have a need to burst in the future, we'll be doing it up in the cloud and not in our facility. Our biggest challenge was how are we going to run the courts remotely? At the time, back in 2017, through an initiative on criminal justice reform, where we eliminated bail in New Jersey, we were running virtual courts on the weekends, just like we are today in all the other capacities, but we were probably doing about 40 sessions a week at the time. We had to spin that up and get it up to about 400 sessions because we have about 400 state judges. And we did that by looking at any available technology that was out there. We were using Teams at the time. We had another vendor that we were using, and then in came Zoom. Zoom was able to burst and handle the capacity we needed, but we already had the policies and procedures and security metrics in place in order to allow us to move into these new technologies, get them up and running, get our staff trained on them, and move ahead. I think just last week we passed 250,000 remote court events in the last year with around 2.5 million participants. So it's been very successful. We're dabbling in things like trials, but other than trials, we've been able to accomplish everything that we've needed to within the judiciary, including some things like adoptions and other things at people's homes, which has been a big benefit to them. And then one of our biggest wins for our staff was we migrated to Teams in one day. We were a Skype shop at the time. Had about 150 users that we had moved over to Teams, so we already had the infrastructure in place to start moving. But on a Thursday, I asked our staff, could they migrate all 10,000 users over on Saturday, and they accomplished it thanks to Microsoft's help. What that would allow us to do was we run around 10,000 administrative meetings between our staff on a weekly basis. And those meetings don't touch our data center. They're able to go right from person to person if they're outside of their building, leveraging the Microsoft Cloud. Microsoft, as well as Zoom, all of our vendors have been fantastic to deal with as we ran into these challenges and tried to burst as quickly as we did. And we wouldn't have been able to do it without the entire technology vendor community. And I know everyone in the courts as well as in other areas probably feels the same, that this whole thing was only possible because of what the technology community did at the time and how they got us up and running. One of the things that we did do as we did all these things, as I mentioned, we kept security in mind. And Saj is going to go through a couple of the projects that we ran in the last year. just to make sure that not only were we at least keeping our security the same as it was when we were on-prem, but what we did to actually expand and increase security as we started dealing with things like what's going on in people's houses, et cetera. So Saj?
Okay, thank you, Jack. So, I mean, Jack was mentioning that a lot happened during the pandemic. There was clearly technologies we already had available that we did. And one of the key ones that mentioned was the desktop encryption project. We had been doing that for the last several years. And basically, you know, we were able to take the desktops home as a result of the encryption on at rest. So that was the key one. That infrastructure was already there. The other one that we had been utilizing was the two-factor auth, right? Clearly, it's a critical function there. We already had it for several different systems. The internal users, meaning the court staff. The expansion of that has continued on to additional applications that are used by our partners or governmental partners, such as police and attorneys and so on and so forth. So that's been a key initiative. Obviously, it requires significant relationships with those folks, and we have been able to successfully accomplish that. There's a third piece of our security, which was a network access control. We're going to get into that a bit more. We have some key policies we had created on that. We'll get into that. So one of the key things we had been working on pre-pandemic was looking very closely at ports that needed to be blocked. Especially, we were hearing about Deja Blue, Bluekeep, ransomware using RDP, using SMB, all of these types of different ports that we were looking at. And the moment that we won VPN, we had to look at that closer, okay? In regard to judiciary, the court staff, VPN has been used. We've used Zscaler it does things like posture assessments, the ability to check for certain conditions before you connect to our network. Obviously, VDI is a big part of that. That's also part of two-factor. We use that there. And some of the two-factor projects that have included, like I was mentioning earlier, have been towards all New Jersey attorneys and our other intergovernmental partners, including police officers. So with the next thing, we're a year later, we're approaching towards the very end here, but a year later, March, and Jack is going to get further into that.
So what can we do? Obviously, I mentioned we've run a few 100,000 remote court events. What we've struggled with are trials. We've run some civil trials, some civil virtual trials. It's really our concern is bringing in jurors. New Jersey, unfortunately, I think right now has the highest disease rate in the country. We're still up in the red area. We've done a fantastic job getting the vaccines out. I think we're crossing the 40% mark on adults vaccinated in New Jersey, but there's still a hesitancy to bring people back into our building. So our civil trials running virtually have just started. We're seeing a lot of success in them, but we have to make a move into criminal. Criminal is really our concern right now. What I think is going to happen long term, we're going to see a lot of, my boss calls it reimagining the courts. We're going through and looking at every single thing we do. We're doing it from the IT side, saying, what have we done? What can we do better? And what do we have to institutionalize long term and make sure we put the appropriate enterprise policies and security around? We're doing the same thing on the business side. The days of the large, we'll call them cattle calls, where you bring in 150 landlord tenant cases or 100 small claims cases, or a municipal court where you have 150 people showing up. Those days are gone. We're not going to be doing that in the future. Our ability to offer things like remote connectivity. If you had to go to a court for a session, just think about it. You might have to take a half day off work. You'd have to, go into the county seat, go into the city. You have to deal with parking, et cetera, for what might be a 5-minute event. Well, if we could do that remotely, we should. And that's largely what my boss has been looking like. And then as well as with our security, my boss has since I was in Saj's position, has talked about a culture of security, and we are in a culture of security where we're continuing to make sure that our that everything we do, we look at security first as we continue to go on. A few of the things are virtual private network, virtual desktops, making sure that who's logging in. We are instituting two-factor both outside of the building as well as on-prem, making sure that we know what's coming into our building through network access control. I mentioned in our first slide, zero trust. We're instituting zero trust so that we know how to deal in the future with things like SolarWinds and some of the other attacks that Saj is talking about. Just making sure that we're pushing the envelope as much as we can to ensure that whatever we're doing securely because we have the public's trust and confidence in our data and processes and procedures.
Exactly. So one of the key things we have done, I mean, Jack was mentioning, in order to get, look, we were basically a 100-year operation that was in person, right? You came in, you saw court staff, you saw juries, you saw judges, you saw attorneys, you were in one monolithic building, and all of a sudden we went remote overnight. Basically, that's what happened, right? And I'm sure that happened to a number of different people. However, a number of different companies and different people that are at this conference here. However, one of the key things with us in terms of the court system is our court system relies on policies and procedures and court directives and rules and regulations that all are more or less, meant for in person, right? So how do we now translate that to a remote environment, right? And just a very basic difference is, Jack and I are sitting in virtual places, physical places, but we're in different places. Now, inside of a court system, we would have been in the same physical location. If I had to raise my hand, it's a certain way, and so on and so forth. But now, the moment I go remote, my network connection, my VPN, my bandwidth, all of these things could lead to problems with justice, which is our topic today, right? How does all of this technology lead to that? So for us, one of the most critical things is keeping the technology up. Jack mentioned that, and keeping the security ongoing. And so bluntly, very directly, it's encryption, right? It's two-factor. It's a lot of these very broad services that are critical. So we have a significant expansion in VPN. It's gone to the cloud. It's between multi-cloud environments. It's a lot going on there, right? And we have gotten to that. Part of what the cloud has helped us with is taking that load, that bandwidth, those issues off of our on-prem network, and has further made it disparate, so we are able to use loads elsewhere, right? Bandwidth elsewhere. So VPN has been a critical feature. VDI also critical. Jack, you want to get into that a bit? Because we were not doing VDI pre-pandemic, and now we are, and it's been a huge help from an end user.
Sure. So just quickly, I mentioned the VDI used for our staff and how that's allowed staff to keep working, but the members of the public also have the ability to come into the courthouses throughout this and sit at public access terminals. One of our big things in the judiciary is transparency. We there's two sides to every story, and we make sure everybody hears every story. So using our VDI infrastructure, we've been able to expand our access to public access systems, and have people come in again securely access case management data, whether it's their case or other cases. And we found that the VDI has been a great tool for us to use because it allows us to do it similar to what we're doing in the courthouse, but doing it in a very secure manner.
Exactly. So VDI has been critical. So network access control. This is something, one of the things I'm going to say is that if security was done during the pandemic, it was probably too late the way that I'm viewing it. So one of the critical things, if you open up any of the controls that you have NIST CSF, you have PCI DSS, you have ISO, any control, one of the top controls, number one, actually, not even top control at the foundational level, is, do you know where all your hardware and software is, right? Basically, right? Do you know where everything is? How are you going to secure something if you don't know where it is? So we had been working on network access control just from a visibility standpoint early on, before pandemic. And we had seen our network, Jack had mentioned about 750 different locations. We needed to see everything, right? And make sure that everything was visible. So that had provided us controls with that. The second part of network access control was the patching. One of the key things we had done from a security standpoint, something we were making sure we were doing, when we were seeing Deja Blue, Blue Keep, all of these types of vulnerabilities in RDP, wormable RDPs, right? Wormable, ransomware, so on and so forth, was our patching, right? So, but then time to time, people would either have those computers off or we needed to make sure they were patched. So what we did was our network access control was able to go in to every device. And if you hadn't been patched up to a certain level, then we just turned on the patching and then you got your patching, right? So that was a critical one. Again, same thing for antivirus. Fourth one, and this was pre-pandemic, but again, it's useful all the time. We have 750 locations, a combination of local courts and more superior, higher level courts. And so time to time, we had seen, people plugging in devices. We were like, oh, we don't like this. So our policies were any Windows devices that were plugged in would be blocked, basically, that were not ours, meaning if they were not cord, they would be blocked, right? And so that was a third policy. And one of the more critical ones, and again, this is a whole stack of things, is any IoT, anything that's plugged in that's not ours, we'd immediately block it. That did create some control things, especially in pandemic, because when an analyst or an IT person goes on site, they have to put in a ticket. They say, hey, I'm putting this device in. It could be a TV. And then we open it for them and then they put it in. So it created an extra step, but it was a worthwhile step in regard to the larger picture. So with the next thing, Jackie will get into some numbers. And there's a quote here by a Nobel Prize winner, Richard Feynman. The first principle is you must not fool yourself, and you're the easiest person to fool. And Peter Drucker, if you can't measure it, you cannot improve it. So with our measurements, Jack is going to get into some of our key measurements here.
So really quickly, as I mentioned back in February last year, we were about 1% of our people working from home. We quickly made that 100%. We've had a couple starts and stops in the last year as the various waves have come through, but we're still sitting at about 10% of our staff working in the office with everybody else working at home right now. The question is what's on the next slide, if you want to just pop to there. Saj.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. Mm-hmm.
The next thing is where are we heading? And as I mentioned, Judge Grant has a committee on reimagining the court. We have subcommittees of judges, staff, members of the public, attorneys, the bar, et cetera. And that, again, we're looking at reviewing everything. I think if we were asking this question of how many people might be working at home last spring, we would have thought it would have been about 80-20, 80% in the building. Maybe we would have been able to have 20% of people off site. There was still a hesitancy, even as we were in the middle of moving 100% of our people and processes off site, as to what would happen. I think as we drift into the next couple months, next 6 months, we're going to see that number is going to change to about 60-40, if not go further. We have seen a lot of benefits of our staff being remote, working at home, the additional hours of support that we're able to offer the public. And I think, in the long run, we're going to see about a 60-40 split where we'll have about 60% of our people in the building and 40% remote.
Exactly. And so these are some of the numbers that, Jack was speaking on. We basically went overnight. You can see the numbers down there. From March 16, as we found everybody in the States, found out at a larger level. And so we took immediately over the weekend and onward, the numbers kept increasing. So some of the security numbers, as we're approaching the end of this, some of the key things we saw was, as you could see by these graphs here, this is by Shodan, who does the public scans and stuff. COVID related domains, right? COVID-19 related domains. You see how much it shot up 4,000%, right? Within basically a couple of weeks. And so we saw a lot of that. So these are things we were paying attention to. We also started to increase email scanning for domains like this, right? Because we were noticing that there was a huge county level, New Jersey level, all of these things were going on. And again from Shodan, we definitely saw upticks in January regarding, I'm sorry, this was in a year before, but in terms of remote port scanning, RDP, we know about that from the other vulnerabilities that were there. And so our security was largely focused on looking at the major drivers in compromises, which were vulnerabilities in regard to RDP, SMB. We definitely had the visibility, so we were able to make the necessary policies there And since we already had the encryption and the infrastructure for two-factor, we were able to do that. I appreciate everybody coming today. Our contact information is here as we approach the end here. You can reach us here if you have any questions.